Thank you very much for being here. We have an amazing panel that I'm really glad to have at the conference, at this panel with me. I am Giovanni Vigna from UC Santa Barbara, and these are the panelists that I would like to invite actually to come on stage. Peter Neumann, Deborah Frincke, Dick Kemmerer, Dorothy Denning, please come and sit. Thank you. Okay, I have to put, I forgot my glasses.
That works.
These are the joys of age.
The ladies on that side and the men on this side.
Okay.
We can deal.
Grace,
Please
beauty.
have a seat. We want to make this as informal as possible. I want to spend a few words introducing this amazing panelist. And I will start with Dorothy Denning, who was a professor at Purdue and then joined SRI, moved to Georgetown, and is now at NPS. I must confess that I'm a big fan because when I was much younger, I read her paper about the intrusion detection model that was actually published in '86 in this conference. And that has inspired a lot of my research in intrusion detection. Not only, it's interesting because I use that paper, Dorothy's paper, in almost every presentation that now, as an entrepreneur, I give at commercial conferences, because there's been a lot of the anomaly detection of modeling normal behavior and detecting deviations from normal behavior that the combination of Dorothy ideas with machine learning have brought back in a very big way in the industry. And so I always tell these practitioners in 2019, go read the 1986 paper that started it all. She was also the PC chair in '83 and '84. She was also inducted in the National Cybersecurity Hall of Fame, which is rock star status, obviously. And she has received many awards, including the ACM SIGSAC Outstanding Innovation Award.
I'll be right back.
Okay, good. I hope I didn't. You said. I know. Did I offend anybody? I didn't even get to Peter. Another of our panelists is Deb Frincke, who's the director of research at the National Security Agency, and so has a big role there right now. She has been there for quite a few years, covering different aspects of education, training, and research within the NSA. Before that, she was at the Pacific Northwest National Lab and was the chief scientist in cybersecurity. And even before then, she was professor at the University of Idaho. So a great resume in security. And interesting, she also did a lot of research in intrusion detection, especially in the smart grid and cyber physical systems. And so I can see that there is a red thread going through all the panelists. She also co-founded a company, I found out, Trigeo, I didn't know that. Very interesting. And she was the general chair in 2011. And then there is Peter, who needed a hat because of the lights.
I can't see a thing.
I think you're absolutely right. That's actually a smart move. So Peter was a researcher at Bell Labs and then moved to SRI, I think I remember 1971 or something like that. He created, I knew of him because he ran the Risks Digest Bulletin. And this, if you were a security practitioner in the 80s, this was how you find out about security stuff before the internet. You had to read this mailing list that would list all the vulnerability, all the risks that were out there. And so it was required reading for all of us. And also, he was behind the IDES system together with Dorothy that started at SRI. And that's another thing that I not only studied very in detail, in great detail when I was younger, but I also had to compete against in a DARPA evaluation in the late 90s. He also worked on multics, and I know there are a few young people here who would say, what? Look it up. It had a lot of interesting things before we thought there were interesting things. And also, it's interesting because it's public record that Peter was born in the early 30s, and he has been always super active. He has a paper at NDSS of 2019, and I found a paper on, an experiment in musical composition from 1957, which makes 62 years in the publication business, which is amazing, and I would say impressed. He also hung out with Einstein, and it was the PC chair in 1982. Last but not least, Dick Kemmerer. He's actually the reason why I'm here in a way, because I came to the United States to do a short postdoc with Dick in 1997, never left. I was supposed to be there for 5 months in Santa Barbara, and 22 years later, I'm still there and loving it. He has been one of the early chair too. He was the chair in 92 and 93. And he has been working on, again, intrusion detection. His state transitional analysis technique is the paper that I read, and that's why at an ICSI in Boston, I came to him and said, can we please talk about your intrusion detection work? And he said, okay, and since then, we've been working together for a very long time. Another thing that is interesting that you might not know is that one of his very early paper was on something called the Shared Resource Matrix methodology that was one of the first formalization to identify side channel analysis, space and time side channel analysis. And this is another topic that has come back in a big way, and I think there was a whole session in side channel at this conference. Okay, so this is our amazing panelists today. And so I will start with the obvious question, and actually this is particularly directed to Dorothy, sorry, I will say that, but it's Dorothy. And it's about how the conference started. I know that Peter and Dorothy especially have been involved in this, and so I would like to hear from them what was security and privacy at the very beginning.
So I'm going to go back into the 70s because the Symposium on Security and Privacy in 1980 is, to the best of my knowledge, the first security conference that was sponsored by a professional association that had a call for papers. And before that, I'm aware of only 2 conferences that were devoted to computer security. The first one was held outside Paris in INRIA in 1974. And the second one, and the first one was focused on operating systems. To the best of my knowledge, I'm the only one here that was at that conference. The second one,
Butler was there, wasn't he?
No, I don't think so. Were you there? INRIA in 1974?
Vaguely familiar.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, and Peter, my husband, yeah. Yeah, oh, okay. Okay, great. Yeah, and then the second one was 1977 in Atlanta. It was called Foundations of Secure Computing. It was put on by 4 people, Rich DeMillo, Dick Lipton, David Dopkin, and Anita Jones. And both Lipton and DeMillo were organizers for the first conference here. So that was in 1977. But the key person in 1977 there was George DeVita. And George had the idea for this conference. And he wanted to see a security conference that was opened up, sponsored by a professional organization, namely the IEEE, with a call for papers. And George did the legwork to form the technical committee on security and privacy, which then sponsored this conference and set up the first Yeah, but just one quick story about George, because the thing I remember most about George is the day he called me up and he said he had broken RSA. And of course he hadn't broken the math still works, but he had found a flaw in how you might use the protocols. And it was really all very exciting, but it led to the paper that I wrote that was one of my favorite papers, and it was called The Many-Time Pad, Theme and Variations. So paper never had that very many citations. I think Google Scholar says 3, but I'm sure the colon is why it got accepted. So another thing that was very significant about the 1980 symposium is that we covered exactly the same topics that were covered in 1977. It was mostly operating systems, database security, and cryptography. And the fact that we had cryptography in the 1977 meeting and then again in the first symposium, I think, was very significant, because in 1981, the crypto conferences started. And I think we could have ended up with a fragmented community. But there were several cryptographers who were involved in both the Symposium on Security and Privacy, and Gus Simmons, who's here, was one of them. And I think that turned out to be key to this conference having the very, very broad coverage across security that it has. I should probably also mention that concurrent with all this, the Department of Defense was holding meetings. And I wasn't involved in any of that at the time, but I went back to see if, maybe that had some influence on the beginning of the Symposium on Security and Privacy. To the best of my knowledge, none of the organizers for the first Symposium on Security and Privacy were at the first DoD conference. There was, DoD launched a computer security initiative in 1978, and they started holding annual meetings in 1979. Eventually, that all became the National Computer Security Conference and then the National Information Systems Security Conference. Okay, so that's kind of how it got started.
Peter, do you have some?
Yeah, I've got some interesting comments here. Number one, Matt Bishop was a co-author of the 30th anniversary paper, as well as Sean and Marv and me. Second, Gus was at the 1981. Dorothy and I were there. Ari Shamir, a few other cryptographers. And in 81, we had 2 panels. First one was a panel on cryptography. And the second one was on what can formal methods do for computer systems. At the end of the first panel, all of the cryptographers got up and walked out, Gus included, and Whit Diffie and Adi. They spent the entire rest of the day out in the lobby talking with each other. I was program chairman in 82, and I created a panel in which the cryptographers and the system guys had to sit together in the same panel.
Interesting.
And I think the spin-off that happened in 81 of the Santa Barbara, you guys take credit for that, some of that, right?
Little bit.
For obvious reasons.
Was part of that. So I think the 1980 and 81 SSPs, in some sense, fostered the spin-off of the crypto community, which we'll take credit for while we're at it. There are a couple of other stories here that are worth talking about. I think the growing surge of looking at systems as total systems is something that is still burgeoning. It hasn't really taken hold, but there were papers that tried to deal with systems as the entirety. The notion of safety and reliability and survivability and security, ultimately, being emergent properties of the entire system, and trying to deal with little point solutions, which has been very popular here.
Yeah.
fails to grab the essence of what's going on, which is that it's the total system, networking, all of the software, compilers, the people involved, the environment, the squirrels eating their way through the power lines and the submarine cables, and which are chewed up by sharks or whatever. It's all part of the problem. So we have this total system problem, and the notion of trustworthiness is one that is sort of pervasive all the way through, but still not dealt with until
We're definitely not.
now. We're beginning to get formal methods into hardware, for example, which we're doing with the cherry architecture, for example. And I think there's a renaissance of formal methods. When we started in the early 80s, we were 30 years ahead of ourselves or something like that. And suddenly the formal methods have become fundamental to Microsoft and to Intel and lots of other places. So I think the renaissance of that is beginning to really take hold.
Yeah, I think there is definitely a cycle where we, as a community, come up with something that might work, but usually we don't have the resources to make it work at scale. And suddenly the computing power catches up. It's like, oh, we can now do that. But actually do that means something that was done, 20, 25 years ago. And I found that, as a continuous, renaissance or repetition of history in different forms.
Yeah.
I would like to hear from Deb and then from Dick about their experience in their first, security and privacy. How was it? When was it? Are things changed throughout times or stayed the same? What is your view on that?
I'll give you two pieces because there was one that is, I showed up as a brand new, so graduate students in here, and students, I showed up as a brand new graduate student and I had no clue what I was walking into. So I remember coming here, I think, well, not here, over in Oakland, of course, because this was the late 80s, about 89, and showing up, and there were all these people that were walking around, and they had written the papers that I had been reading, and at that stage, you don't actually believe that the people whose work you read exist. They were in books, actually on the shelves of libraries. We didn't have Google in those old days. Gray hair here. But it was really fascinating to meet people and learn that you could, in fact, have discussions outside of your room. And I remember the community aspect of Oakland the best, that there were two sets of things you needed to do. One, you needed to see every paper you possibly could, but even more importantly, you needed to step back and meet and talk to all of the people about the work that they were doing next and about your work. And I think that also takes me to when I do begin to remember the conference better, when I showed up more as moving into my professional years. This is where I met the people that carried me through the rest of all those many different places that I worked. And this was a community of people that held each other to account in order to have excellent work, because IEEE Security and Privacy is about excellence of accomplishment. It's about doing something meaningful. And it really was about sharing. I've noticed that very much, that there was and I don't know if that's the same because I haven't been back so much, but it felt like that in the audience out there, that people were willing to share information and talk about who you could go to for help, who would be a good place to go to work for if you're a graduate student, who might have solved a piece of the puzzle that you were trying to address, who might be able to help analyze a paper or work on something you were having difficulty with. And so it was that sense of community. So you asked about things that are different. I'll give you some of that as well. I really think of the last decade as the time when security and privacy became real for the world outside of the professionals. Because truly, I'd say up until that point, when I talked about cybersecurity, it was mostly either people got very impressed or their eyes glazed over, one or the other, or unless they were in the community, and then you could have a sensible conversation. But now, in the last 10 years, and especially in the last 4 or 5, there are sensible articles about cybersecurity. The average citizen is having to wrestle with questions about what is the security of a device they put in their home. And some are realizing that if they don't wrestle with those questions, bad things happen. And this is very different. It happened a lot later than we thought would happen in the Morris Worm days in '88, when we thought that was the big thing that was going to have everybody wake up. So a thing that's different is that the world knows what we do, And another thing that's different is the field has gotten so very large that in order to see the top level of the top excellence, the 15% or less of the papers, we have to go dual track here. You can no longer expect, as a cybersecurity researcher, to understand everything that's going on in the field. And at one point, that was reasonable. At this point, it is not. And so we have to have a different kind and level of collaboration and a different kind of validation and trust in the work that we put forward than we did before when everyone could look at everything. Now we have to rely on the judgment and collaboration of others in a different way. So I'd say that while the seeds of that were laid back in those days, that it is really a necessity now where then it was a nice to have.
Absolutely. I think that I have a similar experience where I remember the early days where you could have read everything about something. And now you always found like 500 other papers that are, popped out around the world in the most obscure conferences that might be relevant to what you do, and it becomes very difficult to do that.
My first job was 1953, working for the Navy, and at that time, there were people who really had their grasp around the entire field. They knew hardware, they knew software, they knew just about everything.
But also the field was inherently simpler. So the systems were simpler. There were not so many moving parts. Dick, what is your experience?
Okay, so my first year at Security and Privacy was 1982. That was because of this guy. 1980 and 1981. 1980, he had workshop number 1 at SRI the week before Security and Privacy. In 1982, he had workshop number 2 at SRI, okay? And because I was a new assistant professor, I didn't feel that I could miss 2 days of teaching, one for workshop and one for security and privacy. I finally came in 82 and had a paper here. I second most of the feelings that Deb had about the intimate, smaller, intimate, friendly. When she talked about being new, I could tell you how that happened, but we're not allowed to talk about those sort of things anymore. We won't talk about sacrificial lambs or anything like that. Anyway, it was small and intimate, and that was really nice. It was nice meeting people like Jim Anderson and Bob Blakely and Gus and Dorothy, and that was really great. The small and intimate also had another side. At that first conference, I gave my first paper, and it was on covert channels, which then became subliminal channels for the crypto people, and then now it's side channels, and so I don't know what it'll be next. But anyway, I gave my paper on covert channels, and I remember someone stood up in the audience and said, "So who cares?" I mean, loudly said, "So who cares?" From the other side, 2 or 3 people stood up and said, "We do." Okay, and I said, "Okay, don't fight. Let me answer the other questions. Okay, and we'll go on."
That was NSA.
And yeah, absolutely, it was. How many of you, just raise your hand, how many of you have been to crypto at the Claremont?
No, security and privacy at the Claremont.
Security and privacy at the Claremont, sorry. Not many. The rest of you are really missing it. How many of you that were not at security and privacy at the Claremont have been to the Claremont? Okay, next time you come here, it's going to be in San Francisco next year again. Please take an extra day or an extra afternoon and drive over the Claremont. Frank Lloyd Wright designed that building. And when we had the early cryptos in there, it was in pretty rough shape. Remember, you had to take a shower early because the hot water didn't last long. And then they made it much better. And after the first few cryptos, we always had a problem with it was too big. We were limited to 300, and then we put the chairs in the back. We were limited to 320. And actually in 1989, at the business meeting, they said, we're oversubscribed. We're turning people away, And I stood up and said, good, okay. And then they said, well, how are we going to, I said, we should turn people away. We should be selective. They said, well, how will we be selective, And I don't know who suggested it. It might have been Terry said, well, we need a czar. And they said, well, who will be the czar? And I said, I'll be the czar. And I said, and you should tell everybody the czar. I said, I'll decide who comes and who doesn't come, you know. And when they can't come, you tell them that it was Dick Kemmerer who said they couldn't come. I said, I'll take the heat. 1989. There's a guy who started TIS named Steve Walker, who also was responsible for starting the National Computer Security Center. TIS was one of the earlier computer security companies, and they did quite well, and he did well. Steve, any of you went out with him, know he was a cheap son of a gun, okay? But he knew I was czar, so he told all of his people that they could go, because he knew Dick Kemmerer would tell a select few of them, you know, some number of them, they couldn't go. That year, we were not oversubscribed. You know, because of the economy, we had less than 300 people that applied, and the czar didn't have to turn anybody away, okay? From that day on until he passed, when I saw Steve Walker, he always referred to me as a toothless czar, because I didn't turn anybody away. I have one more thing to tell you. By the way, we have lots of time because we have a timer up here, and it says 1600, and I know that means 4 o'clock, right? Hasn't changed since we came up here.
Yeah, we're still
okay.
stuck in time.
Still at 4 o'clock.
Anyway, one more thing. As the Claremont got nicer, the prices went up on going to the Claremont. And in fact, all of the military folks had to go, which means like Naval Research Labs and stuff, stayed down at Grandma's, and then came up for the meetings. In 1989, we decided to move crypto. I say we, decided a business meeting. And Tom Burson actually had a contract.
It's not crypto, it's security and privacy.
I'm
but
sorry.
you keep doing
I'm
that.
sorry.
Just do a search and replace, and you're going to be fine.
You're like my grandkids. Don't listen to what I say. Listen to what I mean. Okay? And whenever I say crypto, I mean security and privacy. So in 1989, we actually had a contract to have the 1990 Security and Privacy Symposium. Okay, and since it was 1990, okay, I won't go there. Anyway, we had a contract for that, and at the last day of the conference, Tom Burson came in, and he had told the people at the Claremont we were leaving, and Tom Burson is the guy who always did our contracts for us, and he came in, and the Claremont said that we could come there, they would match the price, and they would pay the penalty for us pulling out of Portland. And so we actually would have left the Claremont for the 1990 conference, other than a Tom Burson working for us. I'll let you go.
I have another question for you guys, because we have another 10 minutes, and then we're going to open the question to the public. But we talked about community security and privacy was really a forum where people would get together. It was a much smaller group. I have great memories from the early days, my early days, which are the late 90s, so I don't compare. But I can tell to everybody who's a young grad student here, take pictures. Because 40 years from now, you will be able to blackmail people in the worst possible way. So take a lot of pictures, because I have pictures from the 90s that I use regularly to blackmail random people. But the other thing that I want to say is, please, I would like to hear from the panel about encounters, events. When you were at this conference, was there an event, a meeting, somebody that you talked to that was meaningful and changed the way you look at security in any possible way? Dorothy, why don't you get started?
Okay, so Peter didn't change how I looked at security so much, but Peter became a close colleague, and eventually I went to work with him at SRI. So that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't met him at the conference. And when I went to SRI, I worked on intrusion detection with Peter, and that wouldn't have happened either if I hadn't gone there. I probably never would have gotten into that area. So,
thank you.
Fantastic. Deb.
So I would say it was a series of encounters, and going back to that time period, introvert, very shy, which is not the same as introvert, somebody wasn't going to push their way forward, a lot of the people here believed in me and asked me to take charge of various things, which was totally shocking, but I couldn't say no because I was an introvert and shy, and those kinds have trouble saying no. So I learned a lot from the more senior people here, pulling me into areas that I didn't think I had any business, and then of course that's been very helpful. Peter was one of them.
Other than being the person who met, who did you encounter?
I would say that my association with Hilda Faust, who was head of security before you, long before you, was really instrumental. And that goes back to 1973, when we started this provably secure stuff on formal methods and hardware design and so on. And then all of the interactions with some of the cryptographers. Witt, in particular, has been a friend and colleague for many, many years, and curmudgeon and wonderful guy to have around. We have a monthly crypto lunch at SRI that was started by Marty Hillman, and it moved to Park, and Tom Burson and Teresa Lunt were involved in it, and then I took it over when that didn't work anymore. And so this whole idea of getting cryptographers together with system people was something that really was important to me, and I mentioned already the 81, 82 episodes.
Awesome. Dick, do you have something you want to share?
Well, I met Dorothy, I believe, in 1982 at Crypto. And in 1983, she sent me an email and said, I've been invited to give a talk on computer security. She had been invited to give a talk on computer security at Leuven, Belgium. She had a conflict, and she said, could you go and give the talk? And I said, okay, yeah, well, Leuven, Belgium, over Christmas. Yeah, okay, I'll do it. You know, I said to my wife, I said, well, you want to go? And we went. What she didn't tell me is that every other person at that conference was a crypto person. It was basically a cryptography conference, and Dick Kemmerer giving a talk on computer network security. And I loved it. It was great. So it actually springboarded me to get even tighter with the European part of the crypto community. So.
I have another round of question, very historical based. So you were there at the very beginning. How do you think this concept of openness has changed through times, or how was it at that time? Nowadays, we see a lot of presentations that they always end up, and my code is on GitHub. It's almost now, mandatory to share your code, your results. But first of all, there was no GitHub at the time, but also there was government concerns and other aspects that play in an important role in the openness of the sharing. And I thought there was a lot of discussion between security through obscurity versus openness. So how was at the very beginning of this conference?
I think from the beginning, it was clear to most of us that security by obscurity didn't work. Yeah. And that the only alternative was openness. And so I never felt there was a conflict there. I gave a talk at NATO in Brussels, actually, in whatever it was, 80-something. No, probably the 90s, on the importance of not using proprietary crapware, if you'll pardon the expression. Yeah. And that also goes back to 84 when I started worrying about electronic voting systems and election integrity, where it's the vendors who have proprietary systems with no audit trails and no ability to remediate disastrous failures in elections because they have been claiming their proprietariness. And so that very much, way, way back in the 80s when I was working with the city of New York, which was trying to acquire $24 million worth of voting machines that were garbage. Yep. It was clear that the openness was absolutely fundamental.
So since the very beginning, you felt that was a big drive. Dorothy.
Well, in the early 80s, when I was at Purdue at the time, Matt Bishop was a PhD student. I was his advisor. And Matt was doing a lot of vulnerability analysis in Unix, and he did not want to publish that information. And so he wrote his reports, and we sent them to selected people. It wasn't, put out in the open. He was very concerned about that. So I think the general sense of publishing vulnerabilities was not as widespread as it is now.
Yeah.
I mentioned one thing for Dick Kemmerer, who wrote the 5 volumes of formal method stuff. I mentioned to Deb at lunch that NSA had made those for official use only, no foreign, and all that stuff.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
For years, you couldn't really.
Still is probably, yeah. But I, in that response there, I had a paper that a student and I wrote, and he used to be a IT, the operating systems guy for the department, plus was also a student, around that time in the early to mid 80s, and on Unix security. And basically, it started out of a class project where I said, here's all of the Unix flaws that I know about. Now find others, understand those and find them. And in that paper, we actually identified the flaws, wrote code to fix the flaws, and distributed it to people like Sun Microsystems, which gives you an idea of when it was. But we never, that could have been an Oakland paper, and we never published it because we didn't want to publish flaws. And,
Yeah, it was definitely different.
and so what happened is, like I said, we gave it to Sun, and they actually put it in the system. But then I used to teach about that every year to my undergraduate class after that. And I'd say, here's a paper, here's the flaws. I'm not going to show you the fixes or whatever, but go and try it. Well, at first I didn't show them the flaws. But then later on I showed them the flaws. And after a few years, they came back and they said, hey, they all work, or a number of them work. So somehow in the updating the system to go to a new version or whatever, they no longer updated them. And so I decided at that time that I'm not going to hold back, knowing about vulnerabilities. Now, you'll know that we don't go out and broadcast it right away like many people, but we'd contact whoever it was and say, here are the flaws, we want to give you time to go and fix them before we announce it. But holding them back forever, you can find that paper. Look up Anthony DiScolo and Kemmerer, and the paper's quoted all over the place because I sent it to all of the academics that went to security and privacy at that time, which was what? About that many, right? And so people would quote it, but it was never actually published.
Deb.
So I think that in fact, what's interesting is that I've gone from wholly engaged in things being open to really understanding some of the nuances behind when you want to keep things secret or private. It takes a huge amount of effort to keep something truly secret, right? So this isn't a kind of decision you should make lightly. But when we talk about privacy, a lot of what we're discussing is keeping information secret about an individual often that might cause harm. Or when we look at industry, we're looking at something that someone needs to keep secret for the health of their business, so they need it for a commercial reason. So I do think there are reasons that should be thought through for when you do withhold a problem that you found. But you shouldn't just do it with knee-jerk, right? You shouldn't just do it because it'll make someone angry. But you also need to consider the impact of releasing that secret. So for instance, in some of the papers I've seen here, I've been really pleased to see, in particular with some of the side channel work, that there's been coordination with those that release the hardware. There are some of the flaws that are discovered that are so devastating that large chunks of our critical infrastructure can be taken down. And I firmly believe that it is not effective or prudent, or to my mind, my personal code of ethics would prevent me, even if I were an open researcher and not an NSA research director, from policing that. And similarly, data that causes harm to people, we've seen a lot of work presented at this meeting that looks over what it's possible to elicit from a model. And so what we've learned as a community here in the last few years, and especially today and yesterday, is that even these models that we generate that look fairly benign and are used for classification purposes could be, if misapplied, used to enable somebody to pull information out about someone violating their personal privacy, causing harm to them. And yet, I'm also an advocate for transparency And I'm also a breast cancer survivor who partly thrives because of people sharing medical information, right? So there are a huge number of nuances, and so I can't come down cleanly and say always yes, always no, but I will say that one needs to think it through and have a rubric and consider in our own ethics as professionals, and then in the individual disciplines, when do you release information? Do we ever stop releasing models? Do we wait till we find out if they can be reverse engineered or not, or do we continue down the machine learning path? What is it that we need to do as a community? So I think that that particular question, it's been around since the beginning. We've all wrestled with it and come in different places. Everyone in this audience is wrestling with that question, and you will never stop, because we're always going to find ways that things will leak or give harm, and where also the lack of releasing information will cause harm.
One quick comment. I think the due diligence stuff has really taken hold in Oakland conferences and in other ones. We spent about 2.5 years on the Thunderclap paper, which was presented in February in NDSS. That's the ATM, the direct memory access IOMMU problems. And iterating with the guilty parties took a long time to get that sorted out.
Very interesting. I would like to open actually the question to the crowd. So if you want to ask a question, please come to the the microphone.
It's not Microsoft, it's Microsoft.
It's crypto. Come to the crypto down there.
Listen to what he means, not what he
It's
says.
a micro
Exactly. The
It
microphone.
it was a wonderful panel. I'm Bhavani Thuraisingham from University of Texas at Dallas, and I've been in cybersecurity since 1985 fall, when I was at Honeywell. And this panel brought me so many wonderful memories. My first Oakland was 1986, S&P conference. And I can vividly remember Dorothy talking about her paper on polyinstantiation, views for classification. And then you discussed polyinstantiation, you presented the view graphs, those transparencies, and then you had these flip things that you showed when multiple users can have different views at different levels. And so polyinstantiation was a big thing in the 1980s and early 1990s. We used to call it the P word. And it even became a little bit ugly. And I think, Peter, you might have been there at the Franconia workshop when there was a panel, and I don't know, you sort of got frustrated, and I think you ended the panel and said, that's it, we have to stop now. So it was
Peter.
just, pardon?
Oh, I say Peter.
Peter,
I was
yes.
gonna say Dorothy
Peter was
became
there.
quite famous for the overlays on the
Yes,
the
Dorothy, especially
view graph.
polyinstantiation.
I think you invented the term, though,
Yeah.
didn't you? Polyinstantiation, I
Yeah.
don't remember.
And we worked closely with Dorothy and Peter and the SRI team because Honeywell, we had won the contract from the Air Force. And so did a sister project. Dorothy and her team had won the contract. Honeywell team was, at that time, led by Earl Bobert. And so we used to have, discussions, and we would meet at Oakland. And so that was just such a memorable, that sort of got me into, cybersecurity. And Dorothy was, or she still is, the queen of cybersecurity. And now we are so grateful we have also someone like Deb, in addition to Dorothy. And of course, Dick, we used to meet at IFIP conference. It was in Halifax. And we had some interesting discussions. Anyway, so that was really, it brought so many good memories.
Thank you.
A question I wanted to ask. Okay.
We were
so,
wondering.
Just very briefly, okay. So, my husband and I, back and forth, we talk. He's a material scientist. He was a professor at MIT for many years. Now he has a startup. Sometimes he gets so frustrated and he keeps telling me, oh, you guys, if the professors become hackers and the hackers become professors, the world would be a safer place.
I think it's happening, actually.
Pardon?
But there's still no question. What is the question?
But the thing is, my question then is, he's saying all this money that they are spending, and what are you guys doing? He uses even a bad word, sometimes calls us frauds for taking money and not doing much, and the hackers are winning. So what do I tell to people like my husband? I mean, I've been married to him for 44 years. I was 20 when I got married, so I can't leave him. So what do I do?
Perfect. Panel, do you have a question? We're losing the war.
Have you considered divorce?
I've been with him since I was 19 plus, so it's 44 years, so
Okay.
divorce is out of the question.
All right.
Yeah.
Panel, do you have a view?
So unfortunately, much of security is an arms race, and the arms race doesn't stop just because you get momentarily ahead. That's a Disney movie.
We've
Play
never
the
been,
credits
we've never
and you're
been
done.
ahead. We've never been ahead.
Momentarily.
Momentarily, no, it's a vision of
All
thinking
right.
you're ahead.
But
Thank
even
you.
if you do, there you roll the credits and you're done. That's not the way this profession is. We will always be playing leapfrog in different areas.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I agree with that. You know, thank God the problem will not be solved, so we will still be here and doing our job being frauds. Paul.
So Paul Van Orshat. It's a question for Dorothy. So if you were learning cryptography in the 80s, you read the Diffie-Hellman paper and then the RSA paper, and well, that was all there was. And then your professor gave you this book called Cryptography and Data Security, and we all read the first half of it, and our heads were so full we never got really to the second half. But it was about statistical inference, and I was wondering about your thoughts about with what you've seen in the last 10 years about anonymization of data sets and all the rest, how that compares to what you had already written about back in the early 80s.
I really haven't been following all the research since then. So, the terminology has changed over the time. We used to refer to it as statistical database security. I guess now people are calling it differential privacy. I honestly, I haven't been reading the papers, so but can't tell you too much.
There is another question? Another question?
Hi, thank you guys for being here. I really respect the wisdom that you're sharing today. There's been a lot said about the past decades, and even one of the previous questions referred to the arms race that seems like we're falling behind on. I was curious if you had some insight into the most important problems we could be focusing on solving within the next 10 years. So sort of the things that are existential threats to the internet, and other things that you think are the most important for us to prioritize.
I come back to the notion of trustworthy systems. I see all of the hype about the Internet of Things and the hype about deep learning and all this stuff. And I keep worrying about the fact that when you're doing life-critical systems, and you used to read the Microsoft shrink wrap, which says, don't use this in critical systems, and yet it is in critical systems everywhere. When you start throwing non-deterministic AI-ish things into life-critical systems, I think the risk problem there is enormous, and I think that may be the driving force in answer to your question.
All right, Deb wanted to add something.
So I guess there's two categories of answers to your question. One is the magic wand, if I would fix if it were possible to do the magical piece, and there's the other where I think that we genuinely could make good progress. And I'm only saying it that way because there's a certain set of answers I would give if we could just fix, if we could have perfect security in all of the systems everywhere. That doesn't fix everything, but it fixes a lot of things. Because everybody's got a different idea as to what they want that computer to do. I and the hacker have a really different opinion as to how we want
The other thread goes back to the old Einstein quote, everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And it's the no simpler that's killing us in the sense that we keep forgetting exception conditions, we keep forgetting covert channels, side channels, whatever you want to call them. We keep forgetting the whole system. Again, I've said this 3 times now, but I think it is really a driving force for critical systems in particular.
Dick, you wanted to add something?
Something very different. I had breakfast with a woman named Jennifer today, and she's looking at how to teach cybersecurity to K through 12. And I think education is a big thing. I think we have to educate the people, and I think we should start at K through 12.
Give them cell phones.
As far as the topics to go do research on, I gave all of those to our lab already.
And I think that the two trends go together, meaning that as we make technology more secure, security becomes a people problem more than a technology problem.
Yeah.
So education goes.
Good point.
I disagree.
You disagree?
I
Fantastic.
completely disagree.
Yes. Why?
Yeah, because the technology is moving faster than we can understand it. If
Okay.
the technology sat still, yes, we could solve the technology problems, but it's not sitting still.
So you say we
But
will
you're
never
saying we
solve the
shouldn't
technology.
Educate people?
What?
We shouldn't educate?
No,
No,
the
you weren't
people
just-
issue is a big issue too. Okay?
That's why it's a
Yeah,
people-
No, it's a big issue, but to think that we can solve the technology piece, I think is just crazy.
No, I think you're misunderstanding the comment, which is that because the complexity is getting so great and the technology is moving so fast, the people can't keep up with it.
Yeah, we can't, but the researchers can't keep up with it either.
That's right.
I don't think
Absolutely.
we win.
I
None of
agree.
us can.
No, I agree, but I was saying, as we, for example, I'm looking at Windows. We were, that's fantastic, Mathias, this slideshow that brought back Commodore 64. I was almost crying. But Windows 95 has become Windows 10. And now, of course, that has become a lot more protected against certain types of attacks. And we will see, we are seeing cyber criminal focusing more on social engineering and attacking the user, because actually just hacking the technology has become harder. Not impossible, but just harder. And we will see always this shifting in tactics from attacking or hacking the computer to hacking the user. That's what I was trying to say. But there is another, sorry.
Yeah, I guess I want to add one more piece to that, because I think there's another bit that ties to your comment. Cybersecurity, privacy, none of it really is a technology problem, because it's how we people choose to use the technology. I would say that even if we fix the technology right now, there would be differences of opinions in this room in terms of how we would use everything. There would be people, not inside this room, outside, who'd want to use computers to do harm to one another. Mm-hmm. There is not going to be any way that you can maintain freedom of ability to use technology and prevent people from using it in an inappropriate way from someone's perspective. And so you can say there are things we can fix about technology that will make it easier for us to make certain principles and practices occur. But if you stop with that, then you've got nothing, because you've got to have the societal decision about what needs to happen, what kinds of information do we want to share. That's just as important as how do we share it. So it's all critical, but if we only say the technology or only the people, we lose sight of the fact that it's systems of people living in a globe with different opinions.
Yep.
So we have at least one last question.
There you go.
Please.
So,
Sorry, we're running out of time, so we have to get one more question, please.
I'll try and keep it short. So I'm Greg Shannon from Carnegie Mellon University, and the question I have will be in the context of can you say one sentence of roughly 10 words in answer to the question? But first, a little background. Because of this conference, I was able to serve in the White House of the last administration in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And what really struck me there was, at the time, all three world leaders were worried about cybersecurity, and they were talking about it regularly. I don't know if you recall the 2015 cybersecurity summit that President Obama held out in the Bay Area here at Stanford. And it continues to be a topic. So if you could give 10 words, pretend you have the president of all three world leading countries in the same room, and you're going to give them 10 words about what needs to be done. What would you say?
All right, that's a toughie.
Everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. Sorry, thanks, Butler.
Stefan.
I don't have 10 words.
No, we have
still
10
ask a
more
question.
minutes, apparently. I completely undershot or overshot, but go ahead.
You're looking at that clock there.
So
Yes.
here's my question. When the conference started, it seemed like there was very much a sense that you wanted to make things secure, and that was a concrete state of being, secure and otherwise insecure. But unlike a lot of fields of engineering where we have a notion of what the objective function is and how close we are getting to approaching the goal, secure versus insecure is a pretty brittle scenario. And so I routinely find myself in a role where I'm talking to someone in industry, and they say, look, there are all these things we can do, and we can do CFI, we can do intrusion detection, we can do this and that, but I can't do everything. So how should I reason about how much security I get for all of these different technologies and ideas? And I'm just curious if you guys had any idea how much of a quagmire that would be when you guys started doing this.
I'd like to put a stamp on this one, in the sense that in the 80s, we were worried gravely about multi-level security, even in the 70s. And it was a fundamental issue for a large chunk of the security community at that time. Today, if you look back on it, you realize you can't have anything that comes close to multi-level security because you can't trust the hardware, you can't trust the software, you can't trust the compilers, you can't trust the people. You can have all the polygraphs you want. It's still not good enough.
Still not good enough. Yeah. So
Right.
I would say the answer is probably no. I think that a lot of us believed that really if we could solve that systems problem, that the rest of it would come out in the wash. And then we went into an era of living with insecurity and layers and the rest.
Right.
Deb.
Yeah, back then we thought we could solve it. I mean, the Orange Book gave us the model of what we needed to do, and but it didn't work out.
It didn't work.
Exactly.
Because nobody wanted systems that could conform to that model.
That's right.
Yeah,
Had to give up too much.
absolutely.
Yeah, you just had to give up all usability.
That's right.
And as
new
you're aware,
technology.
Stefan, once we realized we weren't going to try to get a completely secure system, that wasn't really doable, things were a lot better. Not better in terms of security, but just in terms of the work we were doing.
Sanity.
Yeah.
There is one more question, a couple of more questions.
Okay.
Hi. So not to...
Do you mind introducing yourself?
I'm Oliver Erlingsson, Google at the moment. So not
Ooh,
to...
somebody's changing jobs.
Yeah. Yes. Not to end things on a down note, so we've heard about husbands who call people frauds, and we've heard that Peter says we've never been ahead and that it's hard to measure things. In your sort of perspective, looking back, what are the successes that have come out of this community and this conference in the 40 years?
Dick, you want to take this one?
Then to go on,
I think the
I'm
biggest
thinking.
thing is the awareness that point solutions to point problems don't solve the big picture problems.
I think the big thing
Dorothy.
that comes out of any conference is the relationships that are formed. All the people that I've met and collaborated with, opportunities that came up because of those relationships.
Very good point.
yeah.
Deb.
I think it has empowered the work here, industry, to build things that do make us safer at home, not perfectly safe,
Yeah.
but against a different level of hackers. Should you choose to use the security that's available, you can actually do a lot better job now than you could in the 80s. Not against nation state, but if you take it down to something like your neighborhood pest or attacks on business, you can do a lot more. So.
And yes, yet home routers are easily
Yes.
subverted.
And interestingly enough, it still all works. So somebody was I don't know if they were trying to be reassuring or not, but they told me there would be lots of disasters to come and we would survive each one because it was a system of systems and we had built enough redundancy in that we would go through. So I think the fact that we're all still here despite warning of disaster for 40 years is telling that something good must have come because either that or somebody's holding something really awful for this evening. So.
I think I want to briefly add to this. I think that an outcome that it's very difficult to measure is the level of sort of like check and balances that this community did with respect to what's out there in the world. I think that we don't realize that sometimes you think, oh, CFI, that's a result that has been incorporated. But there is also a general fact that this community looked at many systems that were deployed, voting system, car system, airplane system, and say, hey, this is broken. And I'm gonna explain to you in a scientific way why it's broken. And then most of the time it got better, at least somewhat fixed. And I think that's a big contribution of this community.
Thanks.
What's checks and balances?
Well, looking at
Does the government,
systems and
does the
analyzing
government do that?
Huh?
Does the U.S. government do that? I'm sorry, I don't want to get political.
All right.
Luc Desautel from Samsung Research America again. I have a second question. One problem that I've run into in the realm of system security is that even if someone open sources their code, if they don't actively maintain it, it'll quickly become obsolete as the system it was applied to gets updated. So then future students, or future researchers, have to then reproduce what they had and then build on top of that to have something novel enough to contribute to the conference. Do you have any advice that we could use to incentivize researchers and authors to maintain their code, even if they've open sourced it?
So we're living that dream with Ghidra now, and that is actually a really positive thing. We deliberately released Ghidra, reverse engineering to the community. It is a low-cost, high-end tool for people to use and learn in classrooms and elsewhere.
I think it's a zero cost.
Yeah, zero cost. Well, on your end, when you download it and work it, you've still got to hire your graduate students. So I guess pizza. So that's something for you. We're looking at how we're going to resource it. So I think that when you release a thing and you expect the community to use it, it behooves you to have that plan, so we've got a plan. I think for faculty it's a bit harder because you don't have a budget you can just take from. And so there, I do think that looking to organizations like National Science Foundation, and while we would like all of the money to go into funding novelties, sometimes it's worthwhile to invest some of our scarce science dollars into maintaining what's already been achieved so that there's that giant to build on instead of having to start from scratch. It's what balance you have and who has it and how you disseminate it. So it'd be nice if there was something besides NSF, but I don't know who else to point to that would be a good, reasonable, ongoing activity. But,
There are a lot of real-world problems here. It used to be that the airline industry, the carriers did a lot of preventive maintenance. They don't do that anymore. We don't do preventive maintenance in a lot of other disciplines as well. And this is the long view, the far-sighted notion versus short-term optimization. I think the Spectre meltdown foreshadow stuff is an example of overeager optimization, premature optimization, in the sense that you hadn't really thought through, or somebody really hadn't thought through what the implications were. And it's an iterative process we go around, but I think at this point we're not putting enough effort into maintenance and debugging and get the alpha out there and get first to market.
It's an interesting thing because in this science, you require that ongoing maintenance that came out of the last question in order to maintain the level of science we think we've got. And that's not true in areas where you don't require equipment to move with the times, but here, all of our defenses need to move with the times. And we don't have a good way to invest in that because it doesn't feel like science, it doesn't feel like something the faculty should do, it doesn't feel like something a government agency should do for us, but yet you don't look around and see is there an industry that wants it. I do think that in this area and in other areas of science that are very dependent on software and code, we have got to find a better way to structure that and to invest in that as a country, as a globe, really.
Interesting. Well, let's thank the speakers again, the panelists, I should say. That was awesome. Thank you very much. Mathias, I think that we are going to storm off.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes, you are.
All
Thank
right.
you. Let's keep a round of applause while they exit.
All right. Thank you. It was great.